For years, fans thought they understood Mortal Kombat. The characters, the fights, the story, it all seemed straightforward on the surface. But when Lewis Tan and the cast started talking, it became clear there was a completely different reality behind what we saw on screen. From painful fight scenes that weren't as fake as people assumed, to major story decisions that fans argued about for months, the truth was far more complicated. And once you hear what really happened behind the scenes, you may never look at Mortal Kombat the same way again. The character fans misunderstood from the beginning. One of the biggest debates surrounding Mortal Kombat started the moment audiences met Cole Young. Played by Lewis Tan, Cole was introduced as a struggling MMA fighter with a mysterious dragon mark, someone who seemed to come out of nowhere and suddenly become central to the story. Fans immediately questioned why an entirely new character was taking up so much space in a franchise already filled with iconic figures. Many assumed that Cole was meant to replace or overshadow beloved characters, and for a while that interpretation dominated the conversation. But according to both the cast and the film's screenwriter Greg Russo, that assumption completely missed the point. Cole was never designed to be the heart of the story. In fact, Russo made it very clear that when he came onto the project, the first thing he focused on was not Cole at all. The real foundation of the film was always the conflict between Scorpion and Sub-Zero. Their rivalry, their history, and the emotional weight behind their story were what defined Mortal Kombat at its core. Cole's role was something entirely different. He was created as a bridge, a way to guide audiences who were unfamiliar with the franchise into a complex world filled with multiple realms, characters, and mythologies. Instead of forcing viewers to instantly understand everything, the story allowed them to discover it alongside Cole. That decision was not accidental. It was a calculated narrative tool meant to balance longtime fans with new viewers. Interestingly, this approach came with its own risks. Russo admitted that he knew fans might react negatively, especially because introducing a new protagonist into such a well-established universe could feel unnecessary or even disrespectful. But from his perspective, the alternative would have been worse. Without a character like Cole, the film would have struggled to explain its world in a natural and engaging way. What most fans never realized is that Cole was never meant to lead the franchise forward as its main hero. Instead, he was simply the doorway. The emotional core, the real story, and the reason Mortal Kombat works at all has always been rooted in the characters fans already love. Cole was there to guide you to them, not replace them. And once you understand that, the entire structure of the movie suddenly makes a lot more sense. The fight scenes were more real than anyone expected. One of the biggest misconceptions about Mortal Kombat is that most of the action you see on screen is just clever editing and heavy visual effects. With the level of brutality and speed in the fights, it's easy to assume that the actors were simply performing safe, controlled movements while the real impact was added later in post-production. But according to Lewis Tan and the rest of the cast, that idea couldn't be further from the truth. In reality, a large portion of the physicality in the film came from actual contact, real exhaustion, and in some cases, genuine pain. Lewis Tan explained that while they weren't literally hitting each other in the face every single take, there were plenty of moments where things didn't go as planned. Accidents happened, and sometimes they weren't even accidents. Certain choreography required the actors to take hits or absorb impact in a controlled way, which still left bruises, soreness, and lingering injuries. What made this even more intense was the way the film was shot. Instead of jumping between scenes randomly, much of the production followed the story's progression. That meant as Cole Young became more beaten down throughout the film, Lewis Tan himself was also becoming more physically exhausted in real life. The pain, the fatigue, and the slow accumulation of injuries weren't something he had to fake. They were already there, naturally building as filming continued. This created a level of realism that audiences could feel, even if they didn't consciously realize why it looked so convincing. Mehcad Brooks, who played Jax, approached his fight style in a completely different way, but with the same level of commitment. He described Jax as a pure, brute force fighter, someone who doesn't care about taking hits as long as he can land a decisive one in return. To bring that to life, Brooks studied fighters known for their aggressive, relentless style. He paid close attention to how they moved, how they absorbed punches, and how they delivered power. The result was a fighting approach that looked raw and dangerous, not polished or overly choreographed. Even the supporting cast felt the impact. There were moments when actors watching the fights up close would physically react, almost as if they were feeling the hits themselves. That kind of response doesn't come from fake movement. It comes from something that looks real enough to trigger a genuine reaction. What most fans never figured out is that the brutality of Mortal Kombat didn't come solely from special effects or editing tricks. It came from actors pushing their bodies to the limit, working through pain, and using that discomfort to enhance their performances. The line between acting and reality became blurred, and that's exactly why the fights felt so intense. It wasn't just choreography, it was experience. The CGI wasn't what fans thought it was. When people think about a movie like Mortal Kombat, they usually assume that most of the heavy lifting is done by CGI. Creatures like Goro, supernatural powers like ice blasts, fireballs, and spinning razor hats. It all looks like something that would be entirely created inside a computer. And while visual effects certainly play a major role, what the cast revealed about the filming process completely changes how you understand those scenes. Take the fight with Goro, for example. On screen, it looks like Cole is battling a massive four-armed creature, reacting to attacks coming from all directions. But behind the scenes, Lewis Tan wasn't just imagining everything. He was actually fighting a complex setup involving multiple performers. One stuntman was walking on stilts to create the creature's towering height, while additional performers controlled the extra arms using extended padded rigs. It was chaotic, unpredictable, and unlike anything most actors train for. What made it even more difficult was the way choreography had to be split between different levels of movement. Lewis described having to perform actions with his upper body while reacting to hits happening lower down, and then immediately switching, reacting high while executing choreography below. This kind of split coordination is incredibly unnatural, and it forced him to think in ways that traditional fight scenes never require. And then came the part that most fans would never even imagine. After completing those scenes with stunt performers, Lewis had to do everything again, completely alone. This process, known as shooting a ghost plate, required him to repeat the exact same choreography, timing, and reactions with no one there. Every punch, every dodge, every moment had to match perfectly so that the visual effects team could later combine the footage seamlessly. There was no room for improvisation or error because even the smallest difference could break the illusion. The same principle applied to the film's supernatural elements. Joe Taslim, who played Sub-Zero, explained that when he was performing scenes involving ice powers, there was nothing physically there to interact with. No visual cues, no props, no real feedback. He had to rely entirely on imagination, projecting what the force would feel like, how it would move, and how it would affect the environment. Only later would the effects team build around his performance. What's fascinating is that when Taslim finally saw the finished scenes, he realized that what he had imagined lined up almost perfectly with the final result. That kind of synchronization doesn't happen by accident. It comes from a deep understanding between actors, directors, and visual effects teams, all working toward the same vision. What most fans never figured out is that these scenes weren't just about acting or technology. They were about precision, memory, and trust. The actors had to believe in something that didn't exist yet, perform as if it were real, and trust that everything would come together later. And somehow, it did. The characters were carefully chosen, and some were left out on purpose. When Mortal Kombat was announced, fans immediately began asking the same question: where are all the characters? With such a massive roster from the games, people expected to see as many familiar faces as possible, so when certain major names didn't appear, especially someone as iconic as Johnny Cage, many assumed it was a mistake or a missed opportunity. But according to the people behind the film, that decision was anything but accidental. Greg Russo explained that when he joined the project, one of his biggest priorities was restoring balance to the story. Earlier versions of the script had already drifted too far from what made Mortal Kombat recognizable. Characters were behaving out of place, alliances didn't make sense, and some of the most important figures weren't even present. His job was to bring everything back to its core identity, and that meant making difficult choices about who belonged in the story and who didn't. The absence of Johnny Cage, in particular, became one of the most misunderstood decisions. Fans assumed he was replaced by Cole Young, but Russo made it clear that this wasn't the case. The real reason had to do with Kano. As the script developed, Kano's personality became a central driving force in the film. He brought unpredictability, humor, and conflict into nearly every scene he was in. His presence added tension between characters and prevented the story from becoming too straightforward. The problem was that Johnny Cage occupies a very similar space. He's also loud, egotistical, sarcastic, and often used for comedic effect. When Russo experimented with including both characters, it created a clash that didn't enhance the story, it diluted it. Instead of having one strong personality that stood out, there were two competing for attention, which pulled focus away from the rest of the cast. In a film already packed with introductions, that imbalance could have made everything feel overcrowded and unfocused. So the decision was made to hold Johnny Cage back, not remove him permanently, but save him for later. This wasn't about ignoring fan expectations. It was about structuring the story in a way that allowed each character to have space to breathe. The same logic applied to other fan-favorite characters who didn't make it into the film. Even Russo's own favorite, Kitana, was left out simply because there wasn't a natural way to include her without forcing the narrative. What most fans never realized is that these omissions weren't signs of a weak adaptation, they were signs of restraint. Instead of trying to fit everything into one film, the creators focused on building a foundation that could expand over time. And that foundation relied on clarity, not quantity. Once you understand that, the film stops feeling incomplete. It starts to feel intentional. This was never just one movie. It was the start of something bigger. By the time most people finished watching Mortal Kombat, the conversation usually centered around the fights, the characters, and the brutal moments that defined the experience. But what many fans didn't fully grasp was that the film was never designed to stand alone. From the very beginning, the cast and creators were already thinking far beyond a single story. Lewis Tan made this especially clear when he compared Mortal Kombat to something much larger. He pointed out that, much like other major franchises, the world of Mortal Kombat isn't limited to one group of characters or one setting. It spans multiple realms, each with its own rules, fighters, and conflicts. The tournament itself is just one piece of a much bigger structure, and the film only scratches the surface of what that universe could become. This is why certain story elements feel like setups rather than conclusions. The relationship between Liu Kang and Kung Lao, for example, was intentionally framed as something deeper than what we saw. Their dynamic, almost like two halves of the same whole, was only partially explored. The idea was never to fully resolve it in one film, but to establish it as something that could grow over time. The same applies to the larger mythology, including the existence of multiple realms and the implication that the tournament is just one stage in an ongoing conflict. Even the tone of the film reflects this long-term thinking. While the action is intense and the violence is unmistakable, there's also a layer of humor running throughout, largely driven by Kano. That balance wasn't accidental. It was designed to make the world feel more flexible, more capable of supporting different types of stories moving forward. A universe that can handle both brutality and humor is one that can evolve without becoming repetitive. Behind the scenes, there was also a clear awareness of how video game adaptations had changed over time. In the past, many of these films struggled because they were made by people who didn't fully understand the source material. But now, creators like Greg Russo grew up with these games. They played them, they cared about them, and they understood what made them resonate. That shift allowed Mortal Kombat to feel more authentic, even when it introduced new ideas or changed certain elements. At its core, the film represents a transition. It's not just about bringing Mortal Kombat back, it's about redefining what it can be. A story that once lived in arcades and consoles is now being expanded into something cinematic, something that can continue to grow with each new installment. And while fans may have focused on what was missing or what was different, the bigger picture was always right there. Mortal Kombat wasn't trying to give you everything at once. It was asking you to come back for more. So now that you know what was really happening behind the scenes, what surprised you the most about Mortal Kombat? Was it the real injuries, the missing characters, or the bigger plan for the future? Let me know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories just like this.